Good morning, 2023 Upsell participants. Please welcome to the stage Independent Sector President and CEO, Dr. Akilah Watkins.
Good morning. I need a little bit better than that. Good morning. Good morning, Dallas, this morning. I know it's 8 a.m., and thank you all for being with us. We have an exciting day of amazing panels, and we look forward to a lively, thoughtful, and spirited discussion. So, let me officially start. Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the 2023 Upswell Summit. We're so happy to be here with you all this morning in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. We're also happy to be partnering with SVP Dallas on this year's summit. We're combining the power of Big Bang, SVP Dallas, Annual Social Impact Conference, and Upswell to amplify the summit's impact. Over the next 2 days, we'll discuss topics of great importance to the charitable sector, including the impact of artificial intelligence, compassionate leadership, and the nonprofit workforce. We'll be watching the 3 finalists of SVP Dallas 2023 Fast Pitch Competition make their pitch and see who the winner will be. And of course, our opening main stage, which will start shortly on the state of the sector's health. We have dozens of workshops, spark talks, focus groups, and spotlights over the next 2 days. Take advantage of all of them. We also have a public square with all sorts of activities, coffee if you need a pick-me-up, and a reflective lounge for rest and relaxation. I want to thank you again for joining us at this year's Upswell. And so, let's get started. Let's get started. So I'm going to start by sharing some of the recent research that independent sector has been doing as it relates to the health of the sector. And then our esteemed panel will come out to discuss. All right, so I'd rather walk around here. So really quickly to everyone, we track the health of the nonprofit sector. That is one of our major responsibilities at independent sector. But why do we track it? One, we really want to understand how healthy our sector is. We also want to understand the complete picture of the nonprofit field. That is 1.8 million nonprofits serving over 300 million Americans. We also want to really understand how the sector supports and strengthens racial equity. That is core to our work. We also want to be clear that we want to present data in a friendly way that you all can use it. And most importantly, we want to highlight opportunities for action. So when we think about the health of the sector, we actually think about it in 4 components. We want to think about the financial health, human capital, leadership and governance, policy and advocacy. And we'll get an opportunity to talk about all these areas today and throughout the conference. Some of the takeaways from the Sector Health Report is social connectivity. Our social capital as a sector may be at risk. 2, nonprofit workers, they lack the adequate supports needed in order for them to adequately do their work. And thinking about advocacy and lobbying, we want to look at how nonprofits are opting out of systemic solutions. So what does this mean? When we think about social connectedness, These are some of the things that we're looking at and give us extreme pause and things that we should worry about. The number of donors have decreased by 10% over the last few years. Public trust in nonprofits have fell 4%. And this is statistically significant, which is why we are worried about this number, because that is our social capital. What we have seen is that individuals that have uncertainty about their financial outlook are less likely to trust nonprofits. So when we think about the state of the American economy, we actually pay close attention to this number, because as the economic reality of Americans become more and more uncertain, their trust in nonprofits actually follow the same trend. And that's something we should all be worried about. And this is one statistic we are absolutely tracking. 41% of people report volunteering. So think about the adverse of that. And volunteering is one of the key ways that we're able to track social connectedness and how people engage in the actual civic society, how people actually engage in the actual civic society. So the other thing we want to track is how well the nonprofit workforce is actually doing. And this number should disturb all of us. 20% of nonprofit workers are living paycheck to paycheck. And what that means is that people get up every single day and go to work, and still 20% of our 12.5 million Americans can't pay their bills. The other thing that we are actually tracking is women and low-wage workers bear the brunt of COVID. We know that 2/3 of our workforce are women. We know that low-income workers are scattered throughout our sector, and they have bared the brunt during COVID. And we want to make sure they get the proper support, so we track that. And again, lack of volunteerism actually may risk staff burnout. When we think about the nonprofit workforce, we actually have 3 categories of workers. We have paid workers, we have volunteers, and we have stipends. And so when volunteer numbers dip, that puts more pressure on nonprofit workers who already have a lot to hold. This is the other piece. We talked about policy and advocacy. So when we're talking about opting out of systemic change, this is what we exactly mean. About 31% of nonprofits advocate or lobby. Why that number is disturbing to us is 20 years ago, that number was almost double. And why that is important is because nonprofits are one of the most trusted institutions in this country. And we actually are a huge driver for how Americans get involved in the civic society. And so when we think about that, we also know that nonprofits are a key way that Americans actually go to the polls and actually vote. And so when we think about only 13% of nonprofits actually help Americans get to the polls, when we are one of the most trusted and reliable means of getting Americans to vote, we know we're leaving power on the table. So we understand that regardless of how Americans vote, doesn't matter to us. We just really care that Americans participate. And so, as you can see, we have actually divided the nonprofit sector, so you can see exactly about 70% of nonprofits today neither advocate or lobby for systemic change. This is important to us because all of us work on the consequences of a lot of systemic challenges in this country. And so when we want to think about the long-term health of our populations and this country, it is important for us to work and to advocate for systemic change at all levels. I invite you all to review the full report at independentsector.org. It is free to download. And what I shared with you today is just a snippet. This report is really full of sobering statistics about our sector. But more importantly, it is a call to action, which we will be discussing this morning. All right. Thank you all, and we're going to get started with our amazing panel.
Morning.
Is it early enough for everyone?
I'm awake.
We're all awake.
We're all awake. Well, wonderful. We have something really important to talk about, the health of our sector.
Absolutely.
And so before we get started, I want to give this esteemed panel an opportunity to introduce themselves. So Victor, please introduce yourself and where you're from.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Victor Tolomeo. I'm a vice president at Edelman Data and Intelligence. We are the research firm that has, since 2019, fielded the independent sector health report in trust and health of the trust in the nonprofit sector. So I'm really glad to be here with you all today.
Wonderful. Michael.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Smith. Have the best job in the federal government. I serve as the CEO of AmeriCorps, which used to be called the Corporation for National and Community Service. Hey, AmeriCorps! We've got 1.3 million alum over the past 30 years since the agency existed, so I hope that was some of our alum that are out there. But wonderful to be here today.
Thank you. Carly.
Hey, honey, watch day. Hami takui yushkian wachian kapi. Carly Badheart-Bowl amakiapie. Hey, washichu ia. Dakota ia tokadaki maniwi amakiapie. Wakpa ipaksha hemataha tkandeham bade ota hedwatie damakota. Hello, everyone. Happy to see you. Good morning. My name is Carly Badheart-Bowl. That's my name in English. In Dakota, I am Tokadaki Amaniwi, or woman who walks toward the future. I am Dakota, citizen of the Flandreau Santee Nation, and I live in our Dakota homelands of Minnesota Makoche. Some may know it as Minnesota. Turns out it's a Dakota word. And I'm really happy to be here today as the executive director of Native Ways Federation. So we're a nonprofit organization, a national organization that was founded by national Native nonprofits from across the country, and our mission is to activate and expand informed giving to Indian country through donor education and advocacy.
Thank you. Wonderful panel this morning. Wonderful. So we talked a little bit about the research we've been working on as it relates to sector health. And what we've seen is social capital declining. And we're going to start with you, Victor. With social capital declining, what implications do you think that has on our sector and the American democracy as a whole?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you for pointing out the correlation with personal finance and economics, because that is a really key finding we've seen, not just this year, but for last year and the year before. And basically, it is true that trust in all institutions is declining right now in America. However, there was something unique to nonprofits that we saw in the data this year. And basically, as we saw, the trust was down 4 points. That was the largest drop of any institution that we tested. Most saw a drop of 1 or 2 points. Nonprofits saw a drop of 4 points. So very concerning. And a big focus of the research that we did was trying to understand what was driving that. So what was leading to that kind of unique impact on nonprofits that we didn't see with like the government or with business. And it's related to the fact of how the public sees the nonprofit sector. If you ask most people, what do you think of when you think of nonprofits? Most will say something like, I think of the Salvation Army. They identify the sector very closely with charities, and with human services organizations. And so when we're in a situation like we are right now, with a cost of living crisis, with inflation, a housing shortage that's impacting most of our major cities, people have real concerns. And they look to nonprofits to address those concerns, especially when government is not doing it. They look to nonprofits to fill the gap that government is not filling. And that's obviously a huge expectation to place on the sector, but that is the public's expectation right now.
Thank you, Victor, for that. Michael, we talked about volunteerism in our recent survey and how it's been declining. I would love for you to give your overall thoughts on what do we think this means in terms of social connectedness and the future of how Americans actually engage in service.
Well, thank you for that question. So AmeriCorps is the federal agency for volunteering and service. We have about 200,000 AmeriCorps members that serve in around 40,000 locations across the country. And so chances are, if there are people of goodwill doing something to address a challenge, AmeriCorps members are often a part of that. But we are also responsible for the President's call to service,
Yes.
For trying to strengthen communities and transform lives through the power of service, volunteering, and fostering civic engagement. And so we do a lot of work, like you are, studying what these trends are. You know, we were recently with Governor Moore. Any Marylanders in the house?
Woo!
Hey, Maryland. Governor Moore has one of the most exciting national service initiatives that's coming into play. And Governor Moore likes to talk about this idea that service will save us.
That's right.
And I really believe that. Our data shows that when you serve, it allows you to see each other's humanity. It increases belonging. It decreases social isolation. It increases cohesion. There are all sorts of ancillary benefits for service that are beyond the immediate impact of serving in a community. Actually, Dr. Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States, when he talked about the loneliness epidemic that we're
Yes.
seeing, he included service and civic engagement as a part of that prescription. And so it is so incredibly important to the strength and the health of our democracy. And the data that we actually do a biannual survey with the U.S. Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we recently, you helped us release some of that data. We released some of that data that showed the pandemic period. And we saw for the first time ever a drop in the formal volunteering rate. The number of Americans that say they volunteer on a regular basis with a nonprofit organization. It's usually stayed on average somewhere around a third of the population. We saw a 7% drop
Wow.
in the number of Americans that volunteer formally. And for all the reasons that you said in your opening, that's incredibly, incredibly disturbing. Volunteers are the fuel for the nonprofit sector, not only to help, with all the needs that we have right now, but also for the future workforce. There was a bright spot in that data, though. It showed during the pandemic period, at a time when Americans, rightfully so, were concerned about their own health and well-being, the informal volunteering rate stayed steady and in many cases went higher. So the number of Americans who said, I went and got groceries for my elderly neighbor.
Yes.
I created a learning pod so that the law enforcement officials and the first responders, they had to go to work, but their kids still needed to go to school. And so that stayed at more than half of the nation's population. So I hope that we take this data and we see a real wake-up call. That we have to think about this because it is so fundamentally important to the health and well-being of our nation.
Thank you, Michael. We love bright spots, and that's a beautiful one. Carly, I know you've been doing a lot of work on the health of Native nonprofits. Does this data gel with what you're finding out?
It does, and there's also some important nuances that I think are important to recognize. So in the last couple of years, Native Ways Federation has we've been bringing together Native nonprofits. Leaders from organizations across the country, we've been bringing them together in these kind of focus group conversations around this topic question of what does a thriving Native nonprofit sector look like, and how do we get there? And the idea for this question came from the fact that for so long we've been in response mode. We've been responding to questions and systems and living paycheck to paycheck, and haven't really had that opportunity to come together as a sector to talk about what's the world we want to live in. And we wanted to provide that. So we did that, and we've been having these amazing conversations. So we started these conversations by talking about, one of the first questions we asked was, what does success look like? And it was great. Folks talked about, oh, success looks like we can open the door, the lights are on, we get our work done, we meet our grant criteria. And then we shifted. We said, what does thriving look like? And oh my gosh, it blew up the conversation. Folks got creative, and we started really talking about what's the world we want to live in. And we haven't had that conversation, quite frankly, because we haven't had time. We've been so busy addressing the fires and the Band-Aids that we haven't been able to really think about what does collectively dreaming look like. And it was really amazing. So we do have a report coming out, by the way, by the end of the year. And so please, nativeways.org, sign up for our listserv, and you'll get some more information about that. But, we really need to have more opportunities to come together as Native nonprofits to talk about the world we want to live in and not just be responding to others. I think that's kind of the key takeaway, I guess one key takeaway I want to share. And the fact that, when we started talking about thriving, the things that we talked about, they were unique in some ways, and they weren't in others. So I'll just give you a little bit of a preview of the report, some of the themes that emerged around what a thriving nonprofit sector looked like. And this is from Native leaders from across the country, various size organizations, various demographics, living our values. And we had deep conversations about living our values. What does that actually mean? And not just on paper, but how does it show up in our policies and procedures and how we take care of each other? Relationships and interconnectedness. How do we understand that we are more than, the individual? And I'm Dakota. In Dakota, I looked up a word that we use for thriving. It's wichichacha. And when you break it down, what that means is wicha is together, it's collective. Chacha is to grow. We collectively grow. That's thriving. It's not me, it's us. And so there was a recognition of that. Self-determination. We have the power. We have been feeling powerless for so long, and we're tired of it because we know we have the solutions, and our Native-led organizations certainly do. And so that self-determination piece was key. Adaptability, capacity building on our terms. No more foundations telling us what we should be looking like, what a healthy nonprofit or others. We need to decide that for ourselves. We need to have the time and space to do that because we just haven't. And then financial resources. Having the ability to function at our full capacity, if we had the resources to do that, it just hasn't happened. And we know that there's power there. We're excited. Like, amongst all the chaos in the world, there's some really cool stuff happening in Indian country. We hear often about the disparities and all of the issues, which are very real, and we need to pay attention to those because too often folks don't hear about them. And there's some really cool stuff happening. So making sure that we have the resources to take action and not exist in isolation. Recognizing, and this is part of me being on this stage, so often our people are invisible. Reclaiming Native Truth was a study that came out a few years ago, First Nations Development Institute, EchoHawk Consulting. One of the data points they found was that 40% of the folks they surveyed across the country didn't know that Native people still exist. They knew we existed at one time. Another study a few years ago said that 87% of history standards don't have any acknowledgement of Native people past 1900. We're a people of the past. And then we have all these issues and we're wondering. So this is where, we need help. We need allies. We need folks to help make sure that we're in these spaces.
Thank you, Carly. I really appreciate your voice and your
Absolutely.
research. So shifting a bit, one of the other issues that has become increasingly more important is the workforce. The nonprofit workforce is currently comprised of about 12.5 million Americans. We're the third largest private employer in this country. I've went around this country and conducted a listening tour, and I've visited probably about 7 cities and got to spend some time with urban indigenous leaders in Minnesota a few weeks ago. Everyone is talking about the workforce. People are exhausted. Benefits are an issue, right? So folks are coming back post-COVID. They need more medical care. We don't know what the long-term benefits are of COVID, and organizations are struggling with how to provide those benefits. And one of the major issues is pipeline, right? So post-COVID, usually how the nonprofit sector got people, colleges, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps. And those historical pipelines feel like they're drying up. And so, Michael, to your point, how do we keep a robust pipeline, right? So you lead AmeriCorps. It's a key way that we engage and bring young people into this sector. Are you seeing any changes? And if you are, how do we make sure the pipeline to get really good young talent into the sector is open and robust?
So a couple things I would say. I am proud that AmeriCorps is the fuel for the nonprofit workforce. We have some data that shows about 80% of our grantees hire their AmeriCorps members, and over half of them created jobs. Yes. They saw those AmeriCorps members come in, they're working hard, they're there early, they're leaving late, they've got this spirit, and they're like, we need them. And we see AmeriCorps members in Congress, we see AmeriCorps members running nonprofits, we see AmeriCorps members running schools. You know, so often, you know, we see an AmeriCorps member who may have started off as a city year member, who then becomes a principal of that school just a few years later, or a public ally who years later is leading, you know, one of the major nonprofits in the city. We also have data that shows from our alumni, 40% of them surveyed are still working in the social sector, and 33% are working in public service. So more than 70% took that 1 year of service and have turned it into a lifelong commitment to social action. And so that's incredibly important, and we need to cultivate it. So how do we do more? How do we do more? One, it's become part of what's driving AmeriCorps of the future. At the beginning of AmeriCorps, there was some debate, are we taking jobs? What's the difference between volunteering? Folks see AmeriCorps as apprenticeship, they see it as a pathway. We recently launched with the White House American Climate Corps, which is not only going to help address urgent climate issues now, but it's going to make sure that young people are prepared for the green jobs of the future.
That's amazing.
I was just in Atlanta for the National Public Health Conference with the Centers for Disease Control, because we launched Public Health AmeriCorps with a $400 million partnership with the CDC, because during the pandemic, they're like, who are these young people that are around helping to run testing and vaccination lines? Oh, they actually look like the communities they're serving. Oh, we have 80,000 missing workers in the public health field. What can we do about that? So Public Health AmeriCorps is bringing folks in right now to address public health challenges, but also giving them training, credentialing, certifications, so that they stay in the public health field. And so we are changing the way that we operate, so it's not just a one-off, but you're getting that training that's going to keep you there. But the other thing that we have to do if we're going to keep this pipeline robust, and all of us need to think about this, is how do we reduce barriers to service?
Absolutely.
I was at a conference like this not too long ago where a young AmeriCorps member was asked, she was a young woman of color, you know, do you see your friends doing this? And she said, you know, not a lot of my friends. And they said, why don't you see a lot of your friends? And she said, frankly, they see this as a luxury they can't afford. And so I've been forced to sit with that. Before I came in, AmeriCorps Vista members were making $6 an hour. We just gave a $4 an hour raise to AmeriCorps members, because we cannot ask you to serve and expect, you're welcome. We can't ask you to serve and live off of hopes and dreams and happiness. You've got to keep food in your belly. And so President Biden has called on Congress to increase our living allowance to $15 an hour by 2025. We also have to make sure that we're thinking about housing and other wraparound benefits. And we have to reduce the barriers to nonprofits who want to get AmeriCorps money. We give $1.3 billion a year. But some of you probably know federal money is not always easy. So we're modernizing our systems. We're cutting the red tape. And so if we want to keep this this pipeline robust, we have to have an honest conversations about what are the barriers that stand in the way that make this for potential members and potential grantees look like stop signs and not green lights.
Really appreciate that. So, Carly, does this data around pipeline and hiring folks into the sector, does this gel with the Native community?
It does. I will share that I do, I'll be honest, I struggle with the term pipeline.
Yes.
For many reasons.
Yes.
In part, it's so extractive.
Yeah.
In our communities, often we're the ones who are having to deal with the pipelines in our communities. And so, I do prefer pathways.
Yeah.
I prefer some other terms. But the bigger picture is so real. And when we think about, this idea of, pipeline, pathway, what have you, if we're trying to move away from that extractive nature of it and move into a space of supporting community, there is so much opportunity with where we're at in this time, and yet there's a lot of missed opportunity too. So when I think about the remote workforce, for example, huge opportunity for Indian country, especially for tribal communities where, my organization, we're remote. So I have a number of staff members who live in their tribal communities, and we Zoom, we get together when we can, and it's great. For a lot of our organizations who do direct service, that's really hard. But there is an opportunity there, and yet, because of the issues with broadband in tribal and rural communities, because of the issues with lack of resources for adequate computers and hotspots and all the things you need, we're missing out, and that's a problem. More and more of our Native people want to live in our communities, which sometimes means tribal, rural communities. And so I think that's something that a lot of folks don't necessarily think about, is when we're talking about rural communities, we're also talking about tribal communities.
Yeah.
And there's, again, some nuances. So this is where folks kind of forget about us sometimes because we're, less than 3% of the population. We're often in the other category. We're the asterisk of, over here. And yet, we have federal trust responsibility relationship with the federal government. We have a very unique relationship with states. There's a lot of nuances that are really important when it comes to addressing the issues that our communities are facing in the workforce area. And so that's something that, while the issues, absolutely, we're seeing them, some of the solutions, Native-led organizations and tribes and tribal entities, we have the solutions. We know what needs to happen. And so folks need to talk to us. And I think oftentimes they forget.
Appreciate that, Carly. Appreciate that. Victor, we have spoke a lot about volunteerism. We've spoke a lot around how do we create viable pathways and pipelines into the sector for folks to participate. What is resonating with you, and what parts of the research and data would you like to really amplify?
So I'll throw out a data point, and it's that 62% of Americans who report volunteering trust the nonprofit sector. And that's compared to just 43% of those who don't. So that's almost a 20-point difference. And so volunteering is obviously it's wonderful in itself, but it's also a really critical way to build public trust in the sector. And there's a couple reasons for that. Something we found in the research is that engagement, direct engagement with the public is really powerful for building trust. Trust these days tends to be peer-to-peer. People trust their neighbors, their friends, the people that they work with, the people that they know, the organizations that they have experience with. So to the extent that the sector can bring in the public to see the work they're doing, and volunteering is a great way to do that, that is a really powerful way that the sector can build trust against these headwinds that it's facing.
Yeah, absolutely, Victor. I think that's really, really important to really highlight the importance of volunteerism. So switching to our last big theme around the health of the sector is policy and advocacy. Like really being able for the sector to hit some of the systemic challenges that we're all fighting against. And so in our report, we see that nonprofits are advocating less now than they did 20 years ago. And that has huge ramifications, as we discussed. And so one of the bright spots is that, the sector is getting younger, and we're getting a lot of new voices to the table, and those voices are coming in with very strong thoughts around power, transparency. And so when we think about how do we as institutions create space to bring in new voices and to be able to attack and lobby and advocate against those systemic issues that we're all working for, how do we really incorporate young people into that sort of important strategy we all need to be thinking about as a nonprofit sector? And so, Michael, someone that is responsible for AmeriCorps and working with so many young people and youth leaders, how do we actually capture the spirit and voice of young people as we think about our organizations and how we need to show up around advocacy?
Well, one, I would say the kids are going to be all right. People ask me all the time, how do I feel about this next generation? And, are they apathetic? Are they going to be isolated? Or, they just going to be watching, TikTok videos or what have you. But you only have to look at the past couple of years to see what's going to happen with this generation. Look at how they showed up during the pandemic with all sorts of mutual aid networks and taking care of each other's community. Look at how they rallied after George Floyd was killed. Not only marching, but demanding changes and are still keeping the pressure on. Look at what they're doing around climate change and saying, we didn't create this mess, but it's going to be solved on our watch. Or even look at what's happening in the gun violence space, where they are forcing changes great and small all across this country. And so I'm really excited about this next generation. I'm excited about how we'll partner together, but I think they're going to bring a new energy, enthusiasm, and demand that we have not seen in quite a while. One of the things I do think we have to do, especially for those of us that are working in the volunteering and civic engagement space, is we're waiting too late to engage. We have to start those sparks as early as possible. For instance, at AmeriCorps, we used to have a program called Learn and Serve America, which was about service learning. And we touched more than 1 million K-12 students a year. That program got defunded. It was a big program for President Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. And so we're figuring out now, how do we create that spark at a much earlier age? The other thing that I'm happy to see in our data is that AmeriCorps members, for instance, are more likely to vote. Recent data that we put out showed that 18 to 29-year-old alums were 2 times more likely to vote in 2016 than their peers. We also have a survey that showed nearly 80% of our alums said that they plan on being active and engaged in their community versus 47% of their peers. And so we have to figure out a way that we start those experiences early, that we cultivate it, and not see service as this nice aside, but service really does build this pathway from charity to justice. That spark that you get, where you see something, you see a need, you learn about your community, and then you get this desire to want to eventually create the types of policy changes that we need. The only other thing that I would say is I think many of us have created a freezing effect. I've been in this sector my entire career, and we've scared the hell out of people on whether or not they can advocate or educate. Even for AmeriCorps members, you cannot, as an AmeriCorps member, exercise in lobbying or advocacy, but you need to tell your story. You need to make sure you're telling anyone who will hear about the transformative experience that you're having. And so I think, thanks to work that independent sector is doing and others, we need to make it very clear what those differences are and what folks are able to do, because I think we've made folks very nervous about this issue.
I agree, Michael, absolutely. And thank you. I feel more hopeful listening to you and hearing how you're visioning young people playing a more important role as it relates to advocacy and policy in our organizations. And hopefully those numbers that we're seeing today will change 20 years from now as more young people become organizational and institutional leaders. So Carly, one of the more interesting parts of the policy and advocacy outcomes of our data is that we've seen Native nonprofits be different, right? So where we see the trend for most of the country's nonprofits are actually going in the opposite direction with less advocacy and lobbying, we don't see that in the same way in Native nonprofits. There's higher levels of advocacy and lobbying. And so the question is, what do organizations, and Native organizations in particular, what do you need, and sort of what drives the sort of impetus for advocacy and lobbying that's different from non-Native nonprofits?
We need support.
Yeah.
We need financial support. Unfortunately, a lot of the organizations who are doing this work, they're not sure where to pull it from with the grants that they're getting. Because they're told that they can't do lobbying or they can't do, but even if voter registration, bipartisan, they're still struggling. So we need more general operating support. That's still huge, and it's something that we saw during COVID. We know it's possible. For a long time, folks were like, oh, it's not possible, we can't do that. And then COVID happened, and we saw some folks turning to more flexible funding, and it's like, oh yeah, you can do it. Turns out.
That's right.
So let's keep going. Let's keep going with that. It doesn't have to be just during an emergency situation, especially for our communities who oftentimes feel like we're always dealing with an emergency situation. And so that's important to remember. I also want to note that democracy, we're here talking about democracy, it's an indigenous concept. My son, I have a 6-year-old, and he goes to school 2 blocks away from where George Floyd was killed. He knows who George Floyd is and was, and we pass by, we go through, George Floyd Square every day. We live 3.5 blocks away. He also knows who he is as a Lakota Dakota young man, and that's something that's very important to me. Democracy is an indigenous concept, and yet many of our own people don't know that. We have been so disempowered that we don't even know that the founding fathers came up with this idea of democracy in part because they were looking at the Iroquois Confederacy and these indigenous concepts to create the government that we now have. And our own people don't know that, and so that's where there's been this very intentional, quite frankly, flip of like, okay, we're going to take what's good from your community and we're going to turn it around and use it against you. So our community is still dealing with a lot of voter access issues. I was just talking to one of our founding organizations, Native American Rights Fund. They're on the forefront of all the legal issues happening in Indian country. They have been for the past 60 plus years. They're amazing. They're doing a lot of voter engagement work. And I was talking to Don Ragona from NARF, and he said, we can do education till we're blue in the face, and we have to. We're going to keep doing it. But at the end of the day, access to voting polls in rural Indian, communities in particular, access to voting polls where there's not intimidation happening, especially in these rural communities that are, quite frankly, primarily red states, and folks are struggling. It's an issue. And, we've seen this. There was a couple years ago, well, I can't remember, it was like 2014, 2016 election season, and Native folks turned out the vote. And this was nonprofits. Nonprofits have been getting out there and getting out the vote in Indian country for a long time, and not necessarily getting the funding specifically to do it, but pulling it from wherever they could because they knew it was important, because we understand democracy. And so they're doing the work, and what ended up happening is we started shifting states. Our little population started having some big waves, and what happens? The state starts putting into law, like there's legislation that comes out that says, oh, you have to have an address on your voter registration in North Dakota. Oh, well, we got P.O. boxes. We live in tribal communities where we don't have street names. And so then what happens? The nonprofits put it into gear. And they went out and they figured out, like, okay, let's get ID cards, let's get street addresses. They went to work. And that's what happens time after time. And we'll keep doing it, but at the end of the day, it's like, why? Why do we have to keep doing it? And where's the support coming from?
That's right.
And is it like that we have to like find it from the general operating funds over here and over there because folks are too afraid to fund that work directly? And we can't be dealing with that. Like it makes a difference in our communities. And folks stepped up, and we have had some amazing voter turnout in North Dakota and other places since, but it's because of the work of NARF and other folks from some of the Native Voter Coalition work.
Carly, that was a really, really powerful story. And I think the part that resonated with me is, you know, how nonprofits, especially Native nonprofits, are such a driver to get their populations to the polls, and then how rules change, right? And Victor, I would love for you to talk about, you know, sort of the political divides in this country.
Yep.
And what that's going to mean for nonprofits as it relates to advocacy and lobbying.
Sure. So we asked, you know, a couple questions about this in our research, and if you ask just about, you know, advocacy, you know, educating policymakers about what you do, you know, nobody really has a problem with that. The problem then comes in with this issue of political polarization that is seeping into every different part of our society. And the sector is unfortunately not immune from that. So advocacy itself, nobody has an issue. The question is, what are you advocating for? And then people might start having a problem. So if you look at, if you look at different subsectors within nonprofits, you know, trust is incredibly high for charities, very high for, you know, the arts, museums. When you start getting into things like organizations that, you know, work on the environment and climate-related issues, civic organizations and, you know, getting out the vote and things like that, you see big partisan divides. So let's take the civic organization example. Get out the vote organizations, you know, they're nonpartisan. You know, the idea is to, you know, just make sure that everyone, you know, has the ability to vote and is exercising that. And what we see is that there's a big red-blue split on that, where Republicans and also independents are much less trusting of those organizations than Democrats are. And I think that's incredibly dangerous for our society. And then on the other hand, you've got places of worship, so churches, mosques, synagogues, other places of worship. It's the opposite, where, you know, trust is very high among Republicans. It hasn't really changed, you know, for going back for decades. But you see trust is falling among Democrats and now among independents as well. So whole parts of the sector are now being sort of bucketed into, are you team red or are you team blue? And that, I think, is the main threat facing the sector when it comes to public policy and advocacy.
So with our time left, I want each person on the panel to give one piece of sage advice for our audience. We've talked about a lot today. We've talked about social cohesionness. We've talked about the workforce. We've talked about public policy, advocacy, and lobbying. Carly, what is one thing you want us to walk away with today?
Happy Native American Heritage Month.
Ashe.
And let's think about this more than a month. Next week is Thanksgiving, which is a very complicated holiday for many folks in our community. So I want to put out there, do some education for yourselves. And then, like, do something. You know, take some action steps. Just a few ways that you can do some education that will, I think, help you think about how to take those action steps. One, when our report comes out, which is hopefully coming out by the end of the year, take a look at it, share it. It's going to be called On Our Terms, Supporting a Thriving Native Nonprofit Sector, so nativeways.org. Take a look at that. There's an amazing book that is I think, really getting released this week Nonprofit Quarterly and our friends at First Nations Development Institute co-curated this book called Invisible No More. And it's leaders from Indian country, and it's call to action to philanthropy, but it's talking about a lot of different issues. I was honored to write the afterword for this book, so please take a look at that book. And have that awkward conversation at your dinner table. We need more of those. I know it's tough, but these are human issues. And so, that's the only way we're going to get through some of this is sitting down with one another and having those conversations and sharing those resources. Share the books, share the reports, and go to Native-led resources because there's a number of them out there. Folks oftentimes don't know, but they're out there, and we want you to see them. We want you to share them.
Thank you, Carly. Michael.
I would say take an honest, real look at what barriers exist and work on dismantling them. And I know that is so hard in our work. We don't have enough people. The work is piling up. But one of the things I came in when I came in to lead AmeriCorps, it's like I didn't create this. I don't have a pride in this policy that was created 30 years ago. If it's no longer serving us, let's get rid of it. And so in President Biden's last budget, we're calling for an end of the tax on the education award because that's silly. Why are we taxing people's education award that are serving? We're calling to remove the drug conviction bar because we should be a second chance society. So we are actively looking at dismantling policies that no longer serve us. Or I even think, I was mentioning I was talking about our Public Health AmeriCorps program. When we designed Public Health AmeriCorps with CDC, most CDC workforce programs required you to have a master's degree. And we're like, do you need a master's degree to work in food and nutrition, to be a community health worker? Absolutely not. And I am so proud to report for Public Health AmeriCorps, 90% don't have master's degree of our Public Health AmeriCorps members. 50% don't have any college degree at all because we have to bring people where we're in a crisis moment. And we got to have some crisis level solutions. And it's going to require us to pause and say, what is no longer serving us? And let's rebuild and reimagine together. And partner with AmeriCorps. We've got money. We want you to apply for grants. We've got members that you can hire, and you can always become an AmeriCorps member from 18 to 80 plus. Go to AmeriCorps.gov, and we would love to have you work with us.
Thank you, Michael. Victor.
So I'll just go back to the engagement piece. To build trust in the sector, you need to be bringing in the public, to volunteer, to see what nonprofits are doing, to have that tangible, direct experience as much as possible. And additionally, it's no more is it enough to simply just do great work. Now you have to do great work, and people have to know about it, and ideally they have to have some experience with what you're doing to really build trust in this very difficult environment. And so when you're communicating, we did some message testing in the survey, so I've got a few tips, and the first is talk about how nonprofits benefit everybody. It doesn't matter, gender, race, sexuality, anything. Nonprofits are there to support Americans. And then secondly, language that deals with how nonprofits can benefit people's lives, and the lives of people in your local community is the most powerful for building trust. So engagement, and then hitting those points.
Thank you, Victor. So this has been an incredible conversation. I really want to thank our panel again. We talked about individual solutions for this. We've talked about organizational growth and development and evolutionary strategies. And we also talked about when we have to change the rules, we need to. And so I hope you all have gained an incredible amount of insight as you think about your own nonprofits. And I also want to encourage everyone to go to the app and download the Sector Health Report. And Carly, we also want to encourage everyone to download your report, again, when it's out at the end of the month, you say?
Yeah, by the end of the year.
By the end of the year.
We're working on it.
Yes. because these are incredible resources. And as we think about the health of the sector, it is important for us to be aware of the data, the challenges, the environment in which we all have to exist in, but also those places of opportunity for growth and development. Nonprofits need the rules to be clearer around lobbying and advocacy. They also need the tools to be able to carry out that work. And as Carly has said so eloquently, they also need the resources. So thank you all for this amazing panel this morning. I encourage you to continue to participate in all of the workshops available through Upswell 2023. They're going to be just as enlightened and spirited and amazing and thoughtful conversations about the sector. So thank you all, and continue.
Thanks, Akilah.
Thank you.